Cypress Bend Plantation, just outside Baton Rouge, Louisiana. November 28, 1867. It's Thanksgiving Day in the American South, 2 years after the war's end. Inside the grand manor, Colonel William Hartwell and his 3 sons prepare for their feast. They laugh loudly, toast with expensive whiskey, and wait eagerly for the golden turkey that Ruth, their house cook, is supposedly preparing in the kitchen. What they don't know is that in that kitchen, pork lard boils furiously in a cast-iron cauldron. But it's not meant for frying their dinner. It's meant for them. Within hours, all 4 men would be dead, scalded, beaten, destroyed by the same hands that had fed them for 30 years. And it all began with a daughter stolen, a past denied, and wounds that never healed. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now for the Archive of Fear, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these forgotten stories alive. Ruth stirs the pot with steady hands, but her eyes are fixed on the big house. Inside, the men are making plans for their future. Outside, she's preparing their end. This is the story of Ruth Carter, the cook who served vengeance boiling hot on Thanksgiving Day and made an empire of lies bubble until it burst. The kitchen at Cypress Bend didn't rest the night before Thanksgiving. Logs cracked in the hearth like knuckles before a fight. Iron pots hissed under the weight of boiling lard. The air was thick with cloves, vinegar, sweat, and something else, something older, something patient. Ruth moved through the smoke like she was born from it. Bare feet on pine floors, wrists wrapped in damp cloth, eyes sharp and still. She stirred, chopped, salted, and tasted. But her mind wasn't on the food. It was on the door. It always started with the door. That creaking groan of iron hinges, that burst of laughter from men who never knocked. It had been years, but Ruth could still hear it. Every time William Hartwell's sons returned home, and tonight they were coming back again for the feast. Cypress Bend had changed in name only, not in spirit. The war had ended 2 years ago. The papers said the South was being reconstructed. But on this land, once soaked in sugarcane and blood, the old ways clung like Spanish moss to dying trees. The Hartwell family still ruled. They just didn't call it slavery anymore. Now they called it labor contracts. They paid pennies for 10-hour days, punished with fists and hunger, and called it progress. William Hartwell sat in the big house sipping bourbon, wearing a Union pin on his lapel, the same lapel that had been stained by whip handles and women's screams. And his sons, they wore fine suits now, but Ruth remembered their faces when they were boys. She remembered what they did when no one was watching. The eldest, Marcus, had once dragged a field girl by her hair into the cane rows. The middle one, Benjamin, used to spit in the food Ruth cooked if he thought it smelled too African. And the youngest, Henry, had a laugh that could hollow out a person's soul. He was the one who told her, with that grin, that her daughter had been sent north, sold to a better life. Ruth never saw her baby again. 30 years had passed. The kitchen had grown older, quieter, but the ghosts had not left. Outside, a wagon rolled over gravel. Dogs barked in the distance, boots thudded on wooden steps. The door opened. 3 men walked in, dressed in wool and arrogance. Ruth didn't flinch. She kept stirring the pot, eyes fixed on the dance of the oil. "Well, look who's still alive," Marcus drawled, pulling off his gloves. "Ruth the cook, older than the damn stove." Benjamin snorted. "She's still seasoning with roots and voodoo, I bet." Henry said nothing at first. He just walked to the kitchen table and ran his fingers over a carving in the wood, a little flower burned into the edge. Ruth had etched it there with a nail the day her daughter was born. He smiled and pressed his thumb into it hard. "You ready to feed us, Auntie?" he whispered, not looking at her. Ruth turned. For the first time that night, she looked Henry directly in the eye. And in that look, something passed between them, like a storm building far off over the swamp. She said only this, "Y'all eating real good this year." Then she went back to her pot, and the oil bubbled louder. Long before she was Ruth the cook, she was just Ruthie, barefoot in the mud behind the kitchen house, catching fireflies in her mother's apron. She learned early not to speak loud, not to run too fast, not to dream with her eyes open. The fields could see that, and the fields had eyes everywhere. Her mother Dinah came from the coast, Senegal, they said, though no one really knew anymore. She carried stories in her bones and the weight of lost names in her breath. Dinah never cried where they could see. She only hummed deep old melodies while she stirred gumbo, scrubbed floors, wiped Ruthie's back after punishments. When the pot boils, she used to say, you don't scream, you wait, you watch, then you feed it what it needs. Ruthie was 12 when the first scar came, not from a whip, but from silence. She watched her father, Jonas, dragged through the sugarcane fields before dawn. Accused of stealing a tin of molasses, they tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse, the same one used for curing pork. They left him there, bleeding into the dirt, for 2 days. On the 3rd day, a boy named Henry Hartwell threw rocks at his body. Ruth was made to serve breakfast to the guests that morning. She didn't cry, she watched. By 15, she was a woman in every way that mattered on a plantation. The kitchen became her cage and her shield. They said she had the hands, meaning the seasoning, the smell, the instinct. But cooking wasn't just survival, it was resistance. She learned how to carve meat so fine it fell apart under breath. She learned which herbs softened pain, which sharpened it. She learned what lard did at 375 degrees. And above all, she learned how to look a man in the face and make him believe she was nothing. That was her mother's final lesson. She named her daughter Grace, after the woman who once tried to run and almost made it. Grace was light-skinned, bright-eyed, and curious. Too curious. When Grace turned 7, a letter came from New Orleans. William Hartwell needed to settle a debt. The girl was sold into apprenticeship, he said. No one called it what it was, but Ruth knew. She screamed that night, not in front of the masters, no. She walked into the swamp and screamed until the frogs went quiet. When she returned, her hair was soaked and her hands were bleeding. She cooked anyway. A stew, spicy, thick, and red. No one noticed the difference. Years passed. The war came and went. Men in gray, men in blue. None of them changed Cypress Bend. The name of slavery changed, but the hunger stayed. So did Ruth. She stayed because leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She fed the men who killed her past. She stirred their joy, salted their greed, roasted their cruelty. And every time she saw the sons grow, Marcus with his fists, Benjamin with his bile, Henry with his teeth, she remembered what was taken and what still could be given. On the night before the feast, as the men laughed in the parlor and brandy flowed like honey, Ruth sat alone in the dark kitchen. She held a wooden spoon in one hand. In the other, she held a blade no longer than her finger, her mother's knife, wrapped in cloth. She remembered the day Dinah placed it in her palm and whispered, "When the time comes, don't flinch. Fire needs feeding." Ruth pressed the knife to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't flinch. Thanksgiving morning broke slow and humid, the kind of air that sticks to your skin and listens to your breath. Cypress trees stood like mourners around the plantation, their roots tangled in secrets. The bayou beyond steamed like a cauldron. Inside the big house, polished boots tapped across hardwood. The Hartwell sons, dressed in fine coats and loud voices, moved with entitlement. The formerly enslaved people, now called workers, though nothing had truly changed, moved like shadows, eyes down, hands fast. Ruth Carter stood at the center of the kitchen, a storm hidden inside calm. The table was set to shame God. Silverware gleamed like unsheathed knives. Roasted hens sat stuffed and spiced, sweet potatoes glazed in molasses, cornbread stacked high. And in the centerpiece, a great brass kettle filled with golden lard meant for deep frying the turkey. The men were drunk before noon. Marcus, sweating and red-faced, bragged about his railroad contracts up north. Benjamin boasted of re-educating freedmen in Mississippi, teaching them how to behave like they still got chains. Henry barely spoke, content to watch. His eyes drifted often toward Ruth as she moved between the dining hall and kitchen. She could feel it, that stare, the same look he gave her when he told her Grace was gone. Ruth's movements were measured, every dish served with care, every word silent. She poured wine with one hand and stirred the lard with the other. Outside, the sun climbed. Inside, the air thickened. When Benjamin made a crude joke about how Ruth must have made the turkey from one of her cousins, the others laughed, loud and long. Ruth didn't blink. She returned to the kitchen and added more wood to the fire beneath the lard. The flames kissed the brass and the oil began to roll, thick, bubbling, singing its low, hot song. Marcus entered the kitchen first. Need a hand, old girl? He sneered, lifting the lid from one of the pots. Don't want you teeling over before the meal's done. He reached for the handle of the kettle. Ruth's hand landed on his wrist. Her grip was like stone. Their eyes met. You don't touch what you don't understand, she said quietly. For a moment, the kitchen went silent. Even the oil hushed. Then Marcus chuckled, pulled his hand back, and walked out, muttering something about uppity cooks. Ruth turned back to the lard. It was nearly ready. The scent was no longer just fat and fire. It smelled like judgment. From the parlor, Henry called out, "Ruth, bring us the turkey, will you? Let's see what you've done with our bird." She didn't answer. She picked up the carving knife, the long fork, and the thick padded gloves. Behind her, the brass kettle hissed, trembled, and waited. The fire beneath the brass kettle had gone from hungry to ravenous. The lard inside swirled like molten gold, thick and bubbling, the kind of boil that whispered promises. Ruth stood before it, her back to the door, her face lit orange by the flames. In her hands she held two things, a long wooden paddle and a memory that would not let go. She wasn't thinking of turkey anymore. She was thinking of Grace. The knife she carried wasn't for carving, it was for reckoning. Every inch of the kitchen had become a weapon. The iron ladles, the skewers, the cast iron skillet she'd wielded like a shield for 30 years. The pantry door creaked behind her, and she glanced back just once at the shelf where Dinah's old spice jars still sat. Cinnamon, cayenne, asafoetida, things that made you remember. Henry entered first. No knock, no warning, just that same cocky saunter and cold smile. He leaned against the doorframe and sniffed the air like a man sniffing wine. Smells like tradition, he said. Ruth didn't turn. She just kept stirring the lard, slow and steady. Where's the turkey, Auntie? He asked. You hiding it under your apron? She heard his footsteps behind her. 4 steps, then silence. A 5th step right beside her. He reached to lift the kettle's lid. Ruth moved like smoke and steel. The wooden paddle cracked across his face with the sound of splitting bone. He staggered back, gasping, hand to his mouth. You broke, he started, but Ruth didn't let him finish. She grabbed the thick gloves, gripped the kettle by its iron handles, and in one motion, strong, practiced, final, tilted it forward. The boiling lard spilled like judgment. It caught Henry from chest to waist. His scream shattered the room. He didn't fall at first. He stumbled back, legs blistering, arms flailing, mouth open in a scream that turned into steam. Then he dropped, twitching, sizzling. Ruth stood over him, eyes wide, chest heaving, the empty kettle still in her hands. One down. Upstairs, Marcus and Benjamin heard the noise. Chairs scraped, boots hit floorboards. Shouts echoed through the hallway. She's lost her mind. Get the rifle. But Ruth didn't run. She stepped over the twitching body, grabbed the carving knife, and walked to the pantry. She opened it calmly and pulled out another pot of lard she'd hidden hours before, covered and waiting, just in case. The scream hadn't even finished echoing when Marcus barreled down the stairs, rifle in hand, rage on his breath. Benjamin followed, holding a fireplace poker, his face pale beneath false bravado. Neither of them asked if Henry was dead. They knew. Ruth stood in the doorway of the kitchen, calm as the grave. Her apron was streaked with lard and blood. Her hands were bare now. The kettle lay empty beside her. Smoke curled at her feet like it knew the way. You crazy bitch! Marcus roared, raising the rifle. But he was trembling. Ruth didn't flinch. Put that down, she said softly, or I'll feed you what your brother's tasting now. He hesitated. Benjamin took a step back. Marcus aimed, but not well. The gun fired wide, the shot tearing through a shelf of dried beans. Ruth moved fast, slipping behind the cast-iron stove. Sparks flew. The smell of powder mixed with grease. Benjamin turned to run. Ruth was already on him. She tackled him at the pantry threshold, knocking the poker from his hand. He hit the floor hard. Before he could scramble up, she brought the carving knife down, not into his chest, but into the space between his fingers, pinning his hand to the floor. He screamed. You remember Grace? She hissed, inches from his face. He didn't answer, just cried and shook. Ruth leaned closer. She was 7, and you watched them take her. His eyes bulged. He tried to speak. Ruth twisted the knife. I did too, she said, her voice breaking. And I've been tasting that silence ever since. Footsteps. Heavy, desperate. Marcus returned, now wielding the rifle like a club. Ruth yanked the knife free and rolled aside just as the butt came down. splintering the pantry floor. She kicked at Benjamin's knee, breaking it with a wet crack. He howled. Marcus lunged. She ducked behind the stove again. He followed. Ruth grabbed the second pot, cold for now, and smashed it into his face. The edge caught him across the temple. He dropped the rifle. Blood ran down his cheek, thick and fast. They wrestled. She wasn't stronger, but she was precise. She drove her thumb into his eye socket, bit his arm when he tried to choke her. He shrieked. She kneed him in the groin. When he fell to his knees, gasping, she didn't stop. She grabbed the iron skimmer, flat, wide, made for fish, and slammed it into his mouth, again and again and again. Teeth scattered like dry corn across the floor. Silence returned, slow and heavy. Both brothers groaned on the ground. Ruth stood over them, panting, hair soaked, arms shaking, not from fear but from memory. She looked around the kitchen one last time, at the pots, the ladles, the blood, and then she whispered, "This is the only gratitude I ever owed you." They found the bodies 3 days later. Henry, blistered and bloated, still lay curled beside the brass kettle, mouth open as if mid-prayer or curse. Marcus had bled into the cracks of the floorboards, his jaw shattered, face swollen beyond recognition. Benjamin clung to life for a while longer, but when the doctor arrived from Baton Rouge, he simply stared at the man, whispered Ruth once, and slipped into a silence he would never return from. The plantation froze. The laughter stopped. The horses refused their reins. The wind no longer passed through the cane in song. Something had broken inside Cypress Bend. Not just a crime, not just a scandal, a curse. They sent for Colonel William Hartwell the same day the doctor left. He arrived at dusk, gray-bearded, stiff, smelling of horse and tobacco. His coat was black. His gloves were white. He looked at his house like it was a stranger, like the front porch should have bowed in apology. No one greeted him. The servants had vanished into the woods. The overseers wouldn't come near the kitchen. He walked in alone, and the house swallowed him. The colonel didn't weep. He stood at the edge of the parlor, where Henry used to play cards and drink bourbon he hadn't earned. He walked the hallway where Benjamin had carved his initials into the floorboards with a stolen knife. He entered the bedroom where Marcus once beat a man until his back looked like river rock. He didn't weep. Instead, he sat in the back kitchen, lit a cigar and stared at the blackened kettle. It still smelled faintly of lard and something deeper. The floor beneath it was scorched. The stone was cracked. Ruth's apron lay nearby, folded neatly as if it had resigned. He took a long drag and exhaled into the rafters. "She was just a cook," he muttered. "Just a goddamn cook." But the words didn't feel right. They echoed strangely, bounced back off the soot-covered walls with weight, with judgment, because he knew she hadn't just boiled his sons. She'd boiled the lie of civility, of control, of ownership. The lie that said the kitchen was his domain, that loyalty could be bought with scraps, that quiet meant consent. Ruth had taken everything he built and left it scalded in a brass pot. By midnight, the colonel had drunk a full bottle of whiskey. He didn't sleep. He paced. He yelled at the walls. He screamed her name into the parlor, Ruth, as if she might walk back in and undo it all. But the house remained still. Around 3 a.m., he did something no one expected. He entered the kitchen barefoot, shirtless, wild-eyed. He dragged the kettle back to the hearth, lit a new fire beneath it, filled it with lard from the cellar, barrels meant for another feast, another Thanksgiving that would never come. He set the iron spoon on the hook. He waited, and as the oil began to heat, the house began to change. It creaked, it moaned, it remembered. They found him the next day, kneeling before the fire. The lard had boiled dry. The skin on his face was cracked with blisters. He hadn't poured it over himself. He had simply knelt there, staring, hands raw, eyes wide open, dead. The newspaper said it was grief, said Ruth had escaped after a sudden and violent madness. They printed no image. They wrote no warning. But the workers in the fields told another version. They said the colonel had heard her voice in the walls, heard her footsteps in the pantry. They said she came back, not in flesh but in flame, and that he saw every name he'd ever tried to erase, written in smoke on the kitchen walls. Ruth never returned to Cypress Bend, but the kitchen never cooled again. The swamp had its own language, not the human tongue. It spoke in fog and breath, in the long, slow groan of trees shifting in their ancient beds. It whispered in the slap of water against rotted cypress roots, in the rustle of snakes through damp grass, in the hush of birds that had seen too much. Ruth moved through it like she belonged. Her bare feet knew where to step. Her eyes caught the smallest signs: mud curling in the wrong direction, reeds parting where no wind had passed. She had been in these woods many times before, not as a fugitive, but as a woman grieving, a woman needing silence, a woman needing to remember. Now she wasn't hiding, she was returning. Each step carried the weight of names, names of people no one wrote down, names of men whose backs had been turned into maps of pain, names of women who birthed babies in fields and buried them in secret, names of children who vanished in wagons taken north or nowhere. Ruth whispered them as she walked. Jonas, Grace, Old Moses, Dina. She said each name like an offering, like a drumbeat, like a chain being pulled tighter with each syllable. Her voice didn't rise above a breath, but in the dark hush of the swamp, it might as well have been thunder. She found shelter in a place no white man would dare go, a raised patch of land, half sunk between two forked oaks. There had once been a hut there, long gone now, collapsed under moss and time, but the bones remained. She cleared the space with her hands, moving slow, reverent, as if disturbing a grave. Maybe she was. She lit no fire. She had no need for heat. The swamp was thick with its own warmth, and she didn't need light to see. Inside her sat the memory of three faces, twisted now, broken, disfigured by oil and iron and the truth they never thought would find them. That was enough light. The next morning the dogs came. She heard them long before she saw them, yelping, panting, growling, their handlers not far behind. Men shouting orders, breaking through brush, the clink of shackles ready at their belts. They weren't just hunting her, they were hunting the story. They needed to erase it before it spread. They needed to call her mad, dangerous, evil, because they couldn't afford the truth. The truth was what scared them. She was a woman with no weapon but fire and memory, and she had won. That couldn't be allowed. Ruth didn't run. She folded her daughter's handkerchief carefully, tucked it back into her satchel, and stood. Her bones ached. Her feet were swollen. But her spirit was something else now. Not just a mother, not just a cook. She was history walking. She left the clearing before the dogs reached it, moving deeper into water, waist deep, where the snakes watched but did not strike. The cypress roots reached like hands, guiding her path. When she emerged from the swamp 2 nights later, it was under the shroud of Spanish moss and moonlight. A small cabin stood at the edge of the tree line, leaning, quiet, a candle flickering in the window. Inside lived Mother Adelaide, an old healer who had buried 3 husbands and outlived a dozen masters. No one asked her age, no one questioned her wisdom. Ruth knocked once. The door opened without a word. Adelaide took one look at her, oil-stained, barefoot, eyes full of ghosts, and stepped aside. "You finally did it," she said. Not as a question, but as prophecy fulfilled, Ruth nodded. "I did." Adelaide closed the door behind her. Inside, the air smelled of sulfur and mint. Herbs hung from the beams. A kettle simmered on the stove, not of lard, but of something sweeter. Ruth sat on a low stool. Her limbs felt like wood, but her chest had never breathed deeper. "They'll come looking," Adelaide said. "They already are? You ready to keep walking?" Ruth looked up, eyes shining but dry. "I got names to carry still." Adelaide handed her a piece of cloth, old, frayed, dark with age and smoke. On it were stitched dozens of names in red thread, some crooked, some barely legible. "Add yours," she said. "Ain't no shame in the blood if the hand that spilled it held the truth." Ruth took the needle, threaded it slow, and carved her name in red. One stitch at a time. They tried to reclaim Cypress Bend. Some white man from St. Francisville arrived with his hat tilted like he owned the sun, saying he'd clean up the mess and restore order. Said the house was too fine to leave behind. Said the cane would rise again if someone with a strong back took the reins. But when he stepped inside the kitchen, he vomited. He said it was the smell. Lard gone sour, mold thick on the walls, rats nesting in the rafters. But others knew better. The smell wasn't rot, it was memory. A memory that clung to iron pots and scorched wood like sweat on skin. The same memory that made the floor feel soft beneath your feet, like it might give way and swallow you. The same memory that made the air inside thick, like it had lungs of its own, like it was waiting to breathe again. No one stayed the night. Not the man from St. Francisville, not the crew he brought, not the boys with rifles hired to patrol the fields. They all left before sundown, silent and pale. Some never came back. Some pretended they'd never gone. "The house is cursed," they whispered. But no one said her name, not out loud, because they knew Ruth Carter wasn't a ghost. She was a reckoning. In the quarters, though, the story grew. Quiet at first, passed between old women stirring pots, between boys hiding from lashes, between field hands who didn't believe in salvation but believed in signs. It wasn't just what she did, it was how she did it. She didn't run screaming, she didn't poison the food or slip away in the night. She waited, she watched, and then she cooked them. That was the part that hit hardest. The fire wasn't rage, it was ritual. She fed them what they had fed her world for generations: pain, silence, heat, and justice, one boiling breath at a time. Years passed. The war became a scar no one looked at anymore. The land was tired, the cane thinner each season. Cypress Bend never recovered, not from the killings, not from the curse. They tried to lease it out, sell it, rename it. Nothing stuck. Every time someone tried to farm the land, accidents happened. Men drowned in dry ditches, oxen dropped dead in harness, women miscarried in the shadow of the old smokehouse. They buried the Hartwell name under layers of silence, but the roots were still there, tangled and red. And somewhere beyond the edge of that cursed plantation, beyond the groves of choking willow and the paths only the old ones remembered, Ruth lived. Or so they said. No one could prove it. No one dared search for her. But sometimes, deep in the swamp, hunters would claim they saw a woman walking across still water. Alone, hair wrapped in cloth, skin weathered but proud, holding a wooden spoon like a scepter. She would vanish into mist before they could call out. And if they were wise, they wouldn't call out at all. One night, decades later, a young girl in Opelousas asked her grandmother if the story of Ruth the cook was true. The old woman leaned close, her eyes glassy with the weight of too many funerals. "She was real," she said, "as real as the hands on your arms, as real as fire, as real as every lie they told us in that house." "Did she die?" the girl asked. The grandmother smiled. "Not exactly. She became what? A name they can't bury, a truth they can't swallow." Some said Ruth went further south, crossed the Sabine, changed her name, lived among Creoles who didn't ask questions, and cooked for families who never knew the heat in her hands. Others said she joined a maroon village deep in the swamp where no white man dared tread and became a kind of queen, silent, watchful, deadly with a kettle. And some swore she never left the woods at all. They said she became something else. Not spirit, not demon, a warning. A story sharpened into steel. A whispered truth passed down through the cracks of history, through the mouths of those who survived. They said that every time a man lifted his hand to beat a woman, he would pause, just for a breath. Because something in the back of his mind would whisper, "Ruth is watching." They said that every field still echoes with the faint scent of smoke each November. And that somewhere, in some lonely kitchen where the pots hiss and the fire burns too clean, you might feel her standing behind you, not to hurt you, just to see. To make sure the heat stays honest. The old ones said she was still out there. Not in the way of flesh maybe, but in something deeper. In the way fire behaves when it licks too close to injustice. In the way lard hisses in a pot when the wrong man walks in. In the way silence falls hard when someone tells a lie too close to history. She had become a rhythm now. A heat. A story no bullet could kill, no law could cage, no preacher could wash away. And though her name was never written in ledgers or carved into stone, it was etched into the air of every place where someone dared to say enough. There was a boy, years later, skin dark like burnt sugar, who worked in the kitchen of a white family in Mississippi. He was quiet, fast with his hands, slow with his eyes. The mistress called him boy, and the master called him mute. But one day, when the man of the house raised a belt to the cook for dropping a pot, the boy stepped forward, steady and calm. And before he said anything else, he said, "My mama told me about Ruth. That belt never landed. That man never raised it again." There was a woman in Alabama who stirred her grits with a heavy wooden spoon passed down from her great-grandmother. The handle was cracked, the grains smooth from decades of use. And each time she turned the spoon, she whispered something. Not a prayer, not a curse, just a name. Ruth. and her children grew strong, and her house stayed warm, and no man ever dared come through her kitchen with lies on his breath. They wrote books about generals. They made statues for thieves. They built museums to honor those who never bled. But they left no place for Ruth Carter. They couldn't, because she didn't ask. She didn't plead. She didn't wait for justice in a court that never called her name. She boiled it with her own hands and fed it to the empire. Time moved on. The house at Cypress Bend sank slowly into the earth, taken back by moss and rot and memory. The fields lay fallow, the sugar cane gone wild, growing crooked like it remembered every scream. Tourists came sometimes, snapping photos from the road. No one got too close. And once a year, always around Thanksgiving, someone left a bundle of herbs at the edge of the drive. Bay leaf, peppercorn, rosemary tied in twine laid on the earth like an offering. No one ever saw who left it, but everyone knew what it meant. The final word. They never found her body, because it didn't belong in the ground. Not Ruth. She belonged in kitchens, in songs, in the way a pot sounds just before it boils, in the stories whispered in places where the law still forgets to listen. She was the one who cooked the silence and served it back, smoking hot, with iron in her hands and justice in every drop. If this story stirred something deep in you, it's because her name was never meant to be forgotten. If you carry in your blood the memory of those who burned in silence, if you know that fire is also an inheritance, then subscribe to the Archive of Fear right now. Leave your mark in the comments. Share this truth with those who have never heard the name Ruth Carter, because some stories aren't just history. They're warnings. They're promises. They're proof that justice, even when denied by every official channel, can still find its way when the pot finally boils over. This is the Archive of Fear, reminding you that the most terrifying stories are the ones they tried to erase, and the most powerful ones are the ones that refuse to stay buried.